I'm Francis Dernley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss Vladimir Putin's extraordinary speech this morning, one that saw him order a partial mobilisation of 300,000 Russian reservists and claim that he is not bluffing on the use of nuclear weapons. What is his strategy, and how should the West and the wider world respond?
We
are facing a very serious crisis in energy caused by Putin's war in Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 21st of September, day 210. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's associate editor Dominic Nicholls, our senior reporter Roland Oliphant, broadcasting live on the road in Ukraine, and Natalia Vasilyeva, our Russian correspondent. I started off by asking Natalia for a summary of Putin's speech and its implications.
Yes, we expected Putin's speech yesterday. It was delayed, which was quite extraordinary because we know that Putin is typically very late, but he always delivers what he promised. So this morning he had two bombshells for us, which are an explicit nuclear threat against the West and an announcement that Russia will go into military mobilization, something that he previously said was not going to happen. We have heard for months from Russian pundits, from Russian state TV, about the fact that Russia felt it was under attack, that it was increasingly under attack from the West rather than from Ukraine. And this morning, Putin was very clear that Russia is now fighting NATO, it's not fighting Ukraine. He singled out those politicians, he didn't name them, who, as he said it, as he put it, were threatening Russia with nuclear weapons. And he said that if there's a threat against Russia's territorial integrity, quote, we will certainly use all our means at our disposal to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff. This is probably Putin's biggest statement so far with regards to nuclear weapons. He, unlike his propagandists, have been very careful not to openly threaten the West with nukes. He also mentioned shelling of the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia power plant as a sign that the West was blackmailing Russia, and he said that Russia's patience in that respect is running out. I think it's important to say that we have been talking about the prospects of a nuclear war for a very long time. This is obviously a very depressing subject to talk about. Putin first mentioned Russia's nuclear arsenal early on in the war when he publicly ordered his defense minister to put it on combat readiness. So this morning and his announcement probably makes the prospects of a nuclear war as close as we have ever been. At the same time, we've been hearing statements from pro-Kremlin politicians, from people close to the Kremlin, including Sergei Markov, a former Russian lawmaker, a spin doctor who often expresses some of the most radical views that can often be shared by Kremlin leadership, but Kremlin leadership would be too shy to actually voice them. And Sergei Markov this morning gave an interview to the BBC in which he explicitly threatened the UK with a nuclear strike, saying that Russia would be prepared to answer, to repel an attack if Great Britain, as he put it, continues to be the aggressor against Russia. Also, and at the same time, we have heard the British Foreign Secretary saying that the West should take Vladimir Putin's threats very seriously, that this is not something that we can just laugh off, unfortunately. At the same time, Putin's speech this morning was highly anticipated by Russians. It was something that, as we know, millions of people tuned in last night and then this morning, expecting the worst, And the worst happened this morning when Putin ordered what he called a partial mobilization to support the war in Ukraine. Now, I think it's important to give a little bit of a detail about what he actually announced. The decree on mobilization that the Kremlin published this morning is very vague and actually leaves a lot of room for interpretation. For example, there are no concrete criteria or details about who will actually be mobilized. The decree describes partial mobilization. It talks about reservists. It talks about people with military skills who could be could receive call-up orders any moment now, starting today. But it made a very interesting point, saying that it will be up to the defense ministry to determine who will actually need to be called up now. And I think it's very important to say who could actually be mobilized in Russia. And when you talk about reservists in many countries in the West, you would typically think about people who have done active military service. You could think about veterans. In Russia, this group of people actually is very wide. Imagine you're a Russian man in 30s and you're an engineer, you work in telecommunications. And it's quite likely that you will have a military rank, because if you had an engineering degree in Russia, for example, you would get a deferral from mandatory military service. But in exchange for that deferral, you will have a very short military course on the campus of your university, and technically, you will be understood to have acquired some military skills. And you will even receive a junior military rank, something like lieutenant, without having done any military duty, having been anywhere closer to military site. Now, all of those people, I would say like 30-something engineers, people working in telecoms, they are technically up for mobilization. And we're talking about millions of people. This morning, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu said that this mobilization, that he described partial mobilization, should affect only 300,000 people. But again, this is not something that's written in the law. That's just a statement to the media. That's something that can change. At the same time, we have heard officials and Minister Shoigu saying that Russian citizens called up will be entitled all of the benefits of contract soldiers, those serving under contract. In a way, I think that statement is aimed at people who might be thinking that people who went to war in Ukraine previously, they were lured by a very lavish payment, and this time people are essentially being asked to go to war for free. So the Russian government does say that it's going to pay those soldiers. I guess if we wrap up on the mobilization, I think it's important to say that Putin this time made it very clear that Russia is not losing to Ukraine. Russia is not losing to the Ukrainian army. It's losing to NATO. And he attributed recent losses to NATO, saying that it's an existential fight for survival for Russia, and it's a proxy war, and that's why Russia needs all the resources for that. There's a good analysis piece that we have up on Telegraph website right now by Dr. Mark Martin about what partial mobilization can do, and Mike argues in this piece that we should not be expecting immediate changes on the battlefield, because even if you call up all of those hundreds of people right now, they're not getting to the front tomorrow. They're not going to get to the front until at least 3 or 6 months from now. And if we saw Ukrainian army defeating the Russian forces in the stunning manner that it has, and this is, we saw professional Russian soldiers ditching their ammunition, ditching their equipment, and just running for their lives. It's very hard to imagine that essentially citizen soldiers will make any difference on the battlefield. And yeah, lastly, I guess, if you were to wonder about how Russians are reacting, I think the best example for that is to go and look at the website of major Russian airlines, of those airlines who still operate flights out of Russia. In a matter of hours, flights to the most popular destinations, visa-free destinations for Russia, such as Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, were sold out. And as of this afternoon, there are no direct flights left for most of those countries for the next couple of days. So so far it looks like the Russians' immediate tactic is flee. That has been the most immediate response so far.
Well, thank you, Natalia, for that very comprehensive overview of Putin's speech and also its implications. I know we haven't got you for very much longer, so I'll turn now to Dominic Nicholls. Dom, I've just seen that the Defence Minister Ben Wallace here in Britain has said that in reaction to Putin's speech, no amount of threats and propaganda can hide the fact that Ukraine is winning this war. The international community are united and Russia is becoming a global pariah. What's your reaction to that and what Natalia's been saying?
Yeah, hi, Francis. Hi, everybody. I mean, that was sort of Ben Wallace put that out a little while ago, a few minutes ago. It's as you'd expect. Justin Trudeau made a very similar statement. He said Canada denounces Russia's planned referendums in occupied regions of Ukraine. We will never recognise them. This is a blatant violation of international law. It is further escalation of war and it is unacceptable. That from Justin Trudeau. Now, I take issue with his word there about escalation. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I think we need to be very, very careful about how we use that word. I think it's unhelpful right now and possibly doing Putin's work for him. But in response to what this is about, I think we, the West, or basically anyone outside of Russia, were the second audience he intended. I think the primary audience here was inside Russia. This is the ultra-nationalists, those who have been calling for weeks now, and especially since the Ukrainian breakthrough in the northeast of the country 10 days ago. They've been openly calling on Telegram channels and other social media saying, what on earth is Russia doing? Who's running this war? What's going on? It's an absolute disaster. Putin has to respond to that. He has had to respond to that. He's got to placate these ultra-nationalists somehow. So great. We get this speech full of fire-breathing rhetoric and escalation here, and we're going to recruit 300,000 there, and we're going to have a referendum, and and I've got my nukes. Ooh, don't make me come over there with my nukes, boys. I mean, it's all pretty much the same. I don't mean to downplay it too much because it's very serious, and any conversation that involves nuclear weapons is very serious. But I would just urge people to be concerned by this, but not scared. He wants us to be scared. We have no extra need this morning, I wouldn't suggest, to be scared than we had yesterday. So I think the primary audience here was domestic. I mean, Sergei Shoigu went on after Putin and he was saying the numbers obviously are totally disputed by Ukraine and most other analysts, but he said that Russia had suffered almost 6,000 dead. But we need to mobilise 300,000 now for this special military operation. I mean, it's just, come on, boys, it doesn't really work. And why are you compelling? Why do they have to compel people to join the army if this is so popular? If the reason for this war is all about Russia standing up to the West and to NATO encroachment and all the rest of it. If it's so popular and it's about bringing Ukraine back into the fold and being one nation all again, why do you have to compel people to go to this war? Why do you have to bring in legislation to punish those either in uniform now or not yet in uniform who don't wish to fight? You know, I mean, it's all stick. It's no carrot. I mean, extending the contracts of those soldiers who are in the service now and whose contracts will be coming to an end, possibly very, very in very short space of time. I mean, it's not a popular thing to do. Many people would not have signed up for the greater ideal, would not have signed up for Putin's vision of the world. They sign up for the money, and to suddenly be told, right, lads, your contract is being extended indefinitely for the period of this, as they said, for the period of this partial mobilisation. I mean, good luck selling that to the people now in trenches in Kherson and elsewhere starting to shiver as winter approaches, thinking about the HIMARS that might be approaching. This is not going to go down well. And in terms of 300,000, that's what they're saying. The type of numbers they're gonna call up. Okay, fine. As Natalia says, how long is it going to take to get these people into any sort of frontline service? What do you do with these people? You've got to train them. So you've got to accommodate them somewhere. You've got to find the instructors. You've got to find the food. You've got to find the clothing, the equipment. And all this relies on a good, solid cohort of leadership, and this ethos of leadership and service running through the chain of command. I mean, all the things that we've just amply seen demonstrated over the last 7 months just is not there in the Russian system and in the armed forces. So I doubt whether or not 300,000 will turn up. They're not going to turn up anytime soon. I don't think we were the main recipients, the main audience for this. Putin had to in some way acknowledge the failures up till now. Now he's not going to say we failed. The war's not going brilliantly, so we've got to change tack. But I mean, I think a lot of this was about the domestic disquiet. His words would have admitted failure, albeit the words are wrapped in barbed wire. But the Russian people aren't stupid. They will see what's going on here, and the simple maths, i.e., we've lost 6,000 and therefore we need 300,000 to replace them. I mean, it just doesn't work. So the people aren't stupid in Russia. How brave they are is another question, and whether or not they can organise, whether or not they can coalesce around an opposition leader will be interesting to see in the next few weeks. I wouldn't be surprised if Alexei Navalny slips on a bar of soap in the showers in his prison and is out of action or killed. So what is going to happen domestically? I mean, this is a big risk for Putin. As Natalia says, there's the prices now for trying to get out of Russia have gone through the roof. So if Russia's now trying to arm and organise a huge body of disgruntled people, that's a tricky position to be in, and it needs a lot of pretty expert leadership to manage that issue. And I don't think they have that kind of leadership. So all in all, I'm not trying to downplay the seriousness of this, but I think we are entering phase 2 of this war. Phase 1 was come as you are party. Let's see what you got on the battlefield. We're now entering phase 2, where Putin's got to turn to other means. He's got to turn to politics and other kind of threats. As I say, it's all stick, no carrot. I hope I got that the right way around earlier on. But anyway, it's all stick, no carrot. I think it's mainly for a domestic audience. And of course, at the end, he's always got to say, "Oh, and don't forget, I've got the nuclear weapons." Hoping that we all react to that. We all react to the escalation word, which, like I say, very happy to come back to later. And we all think about the nuclear weapons, and what he's trying to do there is just chip away at that alliance, that external alliance, that ad hoc partnership supporting Ukraine. He's just trying to pull people away from that as we go into winter and the whole the oil and gas crisis expected over the winter. Although, as we've heard, that's maybe not as scary as we possibly thought it was going to be. But as we go into this phase now, or winter, he's trying to take a few of the countries away from the Western alliance by this sort of scary boogeyman status of nuclear weapons. We can talk about nukes in a minute and what it might look like, and there's a whole other discussion that's relevant here. But I've been going on for a little bit, so I think I better let someone else get in.
Thank you, Dom. And to your point about ordinary soldiers' reactions to this on the front line, I think reshifting this war from being defined as a special operation to one that's now effectively a proxy war with NATO. Yes, it will inspire some, but it will be absolutely terrifying for others. And one wonders whether that might well backfire in the weeks and months ahead. But I just want to turn now to Roland Oliphant, who's in Ukraine. Roland, what was your reaction to Putin's speech?
I'm using a parked car as a studio. Classic journalist on the road. I think I've got to kind of divide my reaction into, between the head and the heart, because my head and my heart are kind of separate on this one. To be absolute, my personal reaction, my emotional reaction, I really couldn't care less. I mean, I rolled my eyes. I had to really muster the enthusiasm to care about this. And I think that's because of what we've gone through, really. I mean, I remember back in February, every time, in the build up to war, every time Putin said, I'm going to address the nation, I mean, it scared the bejesus out of me. I remember walking around Kiev with this serious physical rising sense of nausea because the apocalypse was coming. It was awful. What was going to happen? And we'd hang on his word, and then the worst happened. Right? We've been through the worst, and we've had cruise missiles all over the country, and tanks, artillery strikes. Mariupol wiped off the face of the earth. There's been massacre. There's been mass rape. So Vladimir Putin trying to, scare us with something. I mean, I struggle to, how's he meant to scare people with this? And I think that this is like, I'm speaking personally as someone who's, kind of covered the war and was here when it started. But I mean, I think I'm kind of speaking for a lot of Ukrainians as well, to be honest. I was speaking to Ukrainian diplomats about this nuclear issue a while back, and then one of them said to me, he goes, yeah, it's like, the same people who told us, oh, you better not defend yourself because otherwise Putin might get angry. Now they're saying, don't win too hard. And frankly, they don't care because, I mean, the Ukrainians don't care because, look, what's the difference between, dying in a moment of instant sunshine with a tactical nuclear blast going off, or dying, under an artillery barrage? I mean, the Ukrainians believe they are in a war for national survival, and they are not going to. You already see the messages from Ukrainian diplomats on this. Kuleba, the foreign minister, and so on. Like, we don't care. We're not impressed with this, and I think that's genuine. And it's also my kind of feeling. Like, I don't, oh, you're going to scare me with your nuclear stuff again? Well, come on. But now, but let's switch to my head and turn it on. And I think I've got to admit that this is something I think it is something new. I don't think it is quite the same kind of threat that we've seen beforehand. We have had this whole kind of low level, we've got tactical nukes and all this kind of rhetoric on, the headbangers on Russian federal television talking about, we'll wipe out London. Or, I mean, I believe Sergei Markov was on the Today program this morning talking about nuclear war. I haven't listened to that. I'm sure you've already talked about it. But, all these messages kind of partly meant for domestic consumption, partly meant to scare us. It's always been a threat, but I think this is different. I can't remember this. A path to nuclear escalation has been laid out very clearly, and the path is this: we will always defend Russian territory. If Russia's existence is under threat, we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. We think all this occupied territory is Russia, therefore we might use nuclear weapons. And the man who has his finger on the button has basically laid out his readiness to do that. Now, I kind of agree with Dom that I think this is meant to scare people. Right? It's a message. But when do you use nuclear weapons? Well, ideally, you never use nuclear weapons. Or you might use them when you've got nothing left to lose. And on this point, I want to just draw attention to what Igor Strelkov-Gherkin said yesterday. Igor Gherkin, for those who don't know, I'm sure most people do by now, is a romantically nationalist former FSB man who led the first Russian kind of weird insurgency in Donbass in 2014. He said, finally, the leadership of the Russian Federation is coming to an understanding of the total nature, by which I mean total, it's either total defeat or total victory nature of this war in so-called Ukraine, is what he said. Now, this is a guy who holds very extreme views, which I consider kind of romantic to the point, or beyond the point of nutty, really. So he has always thought that the war in Ukraine was about Russia's existence as a state ever since 2014, when he was leading a band of desperados in Slavyansk. Now, I completely disagree with that. I do not think that even the current war is existential for Russia. I believe Russia is going to, as a nation, is going to survive this war, even after what I think is probably going to be its inevitable defeat. I do think that it's becoming increasingly existential for Russia's current government, for the Putin regime. So I don't really see how Putin's government survives an inevitable defeat in Ukraine. It would be so big. It would be enormous. It would be very difficult to cope with. It would be a blow to his credibility. I don't even know how to calculate it. So for that reason, I know I've been droning on a little bit. I think those amongst our leaders who are in charge of kind of nuclear policy should be thinking seriously about what you do if he actually does something. I mean, what do you do, right? What do you do if he drops a bomb on, I don't know, on a battlefield formation somewhere in the Donbass or in Kherson or something else? Obviously, you can't give in to nuclear blackmail, but I think, the contingency plans have to be considered.
Thank you very much, Roland. Well, that seems like a nice opportunity to segue into what's going on in the UN at the moment and some of the reaction to Putin's speech there. Dom, do you just want to talk about the general mood in New York at present?
Yeah, well, we're going to get a much better view of this tomorrow when we hopefully have our correspondent in the States, Josie Enzo, who's going to be dialing in for this. So we'll get the reaction from today, because I think they've yet to start really speaking today. There was some readout yesterday, some little bilats and bits and pieces on the edges, but I think it really kicks off today in the General Assembly. But I mean, there has been a very robust and united response from those that have offered an opinion so far. So you mentioned Ben Wallace, British Defence Secretary, his comments. Justin Trudeau, I just read out. Bridget Bronk, the US's ambassador to Ukraine, has spoken as well. In a tweet, she said that this action, the sham referendum, as she calls it, is a sign of weakness. They're a sign of weakness and of Russia's failure. German Vice Chancellor making similar comments. So, as you'd expect. Well, no, actually, you wouldn't expect, given what we saw on the diplomatic front in the first few months of the war. But there is now a united front, seemingly, and from those you would want to, you might expect to hear from, but would want to. So the leaders. I mean, Germany, very senior player in Europe for all the early foot dragging, if you like, in the war, but seems to have turned up now. Yet hear anything? Probably not going to hear anything from China. That would be very, very interesting. I'm really looking forward to asking Josie tomorrow about the mood music, as in the body language and what's happening in the corridors when people are passing each other. What's coming out from China, and also from the other states that you might think would historically be leaning towards Russia. We've spoken in recent days about Russia's waning influence in Central Asia and the moves by Kazakhstan and Armenia, for example, who are possibly looking elsewhere for security relationships. So to be really interesting to see what response there is from these countries. India as well, major power broker. Narendra Modi, we know, spoke to Putin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit last week, and basically said, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said, if I might have my notes here somewhere, but he said that war is not what we do anymore. Basically, I can't remember. I haven't got the quote exactly to hand, but he was very, very publicly. It was very publicly expressed in Uzbekistan as well at the meeting of the CSTO there, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization there, that by China and India, that they were unhappy with the course of the war, this lightning advance that's not materialized. So there is so far a fairly robust block against Russia's move. Now, how that is going to, whether Putin can respond to that, because of course he's framed this all as Fortress Russia against the West and against NATO and so on and so forth. So any comments, unless he's changing his position behind closed doors to some of those countries who are able to speak to him. Turkey is a very interesting one here. Turkey, obviously a member of NATO, very pivotal in this current war, but it's still able to speak to Russia and does so. So it'd be very interesting if there's any comment there from Mr. Erdogan. But in terms of Russia's narrative that this is him against the West, I doubt whether or not we'll see any kind of reflection of these concerns from behind closed doors. So he's sort of made his bed, he's going to lie in it now, and we will have to look to these other countries for any sign of disgruntlement. But I do agree with Roland's heart in that nothing has massively changed. These threats are the same that we've seen all along this. So this idea that you have a referendum in Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts and they all decide we want to join Russia, and Putin then suggesting that therefore any further attack there is an attack on Russia and will be met with dire consequences. Well, I mean, that's what's been happening in Crimea since 2014. They had a sham referendum there, and Crimea voted, I think, 97% to join Russia. There have been attacks on Crimea, with no nuclear response. So again, I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm saying we should be concerned, not scared. We've seen this before. We've been living through it for 7 months, and certainly in the last couple of months, Crimea has taken an absolute pounding, and Russia's response has not been escalatory, that word again. So we just need to be a little cautious here. They do use, Russian officials do use the threat of nuclear weapons and references to the use of nuclear weapons much more freely than we generally do in the West. It's partly because it's just the way they are in their military systems, but also because they know it presses our buttons. But now we need to respond to that. We know that it does press out, and rightly so, because these are horrific weapons. But we just need to be a little cautious here and not see this as too much of a diversion, if at all, from where we were yesterday.
Well, thank you, Dom. Let's turn now then to the fundamental question, which is how we think the West should respond to this. It strikes me, as we've talked about in the podcast in the past, that one approach might be, and it'd be interesting to get both of your reflections on this, might be some kind of joint statement from within the UN, including the members of the two blocs, whether it be the democratic and the autocratic. So if we could get China and India on board with this, to make some kind of anti-nuclear statement, saying and making very clear what they would do if Putin were to use some sort of tactical nuclear weapon on Ukraine, because I worry that there's been this orthodoxy of strategic ambiguity now for years on this issue, but actually it's strengthened Russia's hand. If we had made it clearer as the West collectively what we would do if Ukraine was invaded, then I think that the war could have been prevented, that Putin would never have acted with the invasion in the first place. And I think there's a strong case to be made that by discussing these matters publicly and what we would respond to, it reduces Russia's ability to shape the narrative in the way that it has. And ultimately, we as the West have to accept the fact that there must be some sort of red line, that you can't always say, well, they're threatening us with nukes and so we have to stop now. At the end of the day, if that's hovering over you, you have to know how far you're willing to take, because ultimately, if we are saying that you can allow a country to take territory that's 3 times the size of Belgium and won't do anything because they're threatening nuclear escalation, what message does that send the wider world? So that's some food for thought. I'd be interested to hear your reaction. And what do you think, Roland? How would you be advising the West respond to this?
I mean, I think part of the reason for my kind of emotional complacence is that I don't have to make those decisions. And actually, I've just been, looking at Twitter as in the back seat as we drive, and kind of seeing a lot of people have the same kind of thing, like, oh, well, the West can never give in to this, it's just nuclear blackmail, etc., etc. But the truth is, you have to have these contingency plans. Mutual assured destruction is meant to mean we never have to use these nuclear weapons, but we have to have them so that we don't have to use them. And then suddenly, if somebody does use them, then you have to use them. It's that old mad. Do you remember that sketch from Yes, Prime Minister? Where they talk through. The Russians don't know that you won't use it. They probably know that I know that they won't use it. But we're sadly at that point where I feel like exactly we might be at the point where the captain of a Trident nuclear submarine may have to press the button in response, because there does have to be a clear red line. And I don't know what that response would be. And I would imagine that it's being worked out in the White House and the Ministry of Defense and Whitehall and places like that. And my suspicion would be that will be communicated quietly to Moscow via back channels. We know that the Americans don't see any distinction between use of what we call a tactical nuclear weapon, a small one, or a strategic one. As far as Western doctrine is concerned, if you use a nuclear weapon, you've used a nuclear weapon. And we're not going to kind of say, oh, it was only a little one. Oh, we'll let you get away with that. So, yeah, I think some kind of line definitely has to be drawn. Again, just to reiterate, like, Dom's right, we shouldn't be panicked by it. But this is the moves that have been announced, both the mobilization and the kind of escalatory pathway via recognition of the republics, are our response to a major defeat, which could spiral into a proper loss of the war, defeat in the war, which I think the Kremlin probably views as existential for itself. And that's why I think we're in risky territory. And the other thing I'd add is that there is this sense that this is for public consumption for the right-wing headbangers, but the right-wing headbangers aren't just kind of war correspondents on Telegram or Igor Gherkin. Right? So Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of the Security Council in Russia, he gave an interview in April, all right, talking about we need to have full mobilization and basically we have to have the Second World War. That's what we're going to redo, the Second World War. Everyone has to be mobilized and we're going to have total war against the West and all of this. And Putin has resisted that. The fact that he hasn't gone all the way, he's only at partial mobilization, he understands the backlash this could produce in Russian society, suggests that that faction in the Kremlin is winning the argument to some degree. And I wouldn't dismiss their willingness to do something very destructive, if that helps. So the short answer is I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure policymakers are thinking it through.
Thanks, Roland. And yeah, I do wonder whether, in a sense, the most important political powers at UN at the moment are less the Western powers, as I say, but are more powers like China and India, which if they were to launch some kind of statement together saying that they also denounce these kind of remarks made by Putin, that would be very, very powerful indeed. And not so much for sending a message to Putin, because I think we can accept the fact that he is surrounded now and feels that his time in office may well be coming to an end as a consequence of his mistakes in Ukraine. But it would send an even clearer message to those around him and we know that some of them have wobbled in the past. We remember that very much at the beginning of the conflict when there was that security briefing that was publicised on television, and you could see how concerned some of the people who were his advisors about proceeding with the war in Ukraine. And so there are people who are still rational around him. And if there were some sort of joint statement from Russia's allies, in inverted commas, that denounced this, and it would send a clearer signal to them that whatever Putin may well be doing, it need not bring you with him, that there is an alternative. But Don, what's your reaction to that and what Roland was saying on this question of how the West should respond to this?
Well, first of all, let me lance the boil of escalation, if that's not too grimy a metaphor at this time of day. Apologies for that. I mean, my issue with the word escalation is that we very quickly reach for the analogy of an escalatory ladder. Obviously, a ladder just goes straight up or straight down, and we therefore couch ourselves, we frame the narrative that anything short of a retreat, which would be going down the escalatory ladder, anything else is going up. And we say, oh, this is escalatory, which we kind of in our minds, we think, well, you're going up another rung, you're going up another level. And of course, the ladder's got to go somewhere and it ends. And at the top, I think we are, it's not been vocalized, it's just me sort of ranting from the minor marge. I apologize for that. But, I think we see nuclear weapons at the top of this ladder. So every time we talk about this is an escalatory measure, that might be deemed escalatory, we are saying we are moving closer and closer and closer to a nuclear exchange. And I don't think escalation, or I don't think actions here in Ukraine work like that. I don't think everything is escalatory up that single channel. I think this is a move absolutely designed to, if you like, go sideways, a sort of almost an expansion rather than an escalation. I mean, this is very much a political move. These referendums in Luhansk and Donetsk, as I said, we've seen it before. We saw it in Crimea, and we saw the response there, or the lack of a heated response there. So this is more of the same. I don't see I don't see it as an escalation, and hence, because it's very easy for us to box ourselves in and start talking about nuclear weapons. And once that becomes into the general debate and it becomes normalised, I don't think that's particularly healthy. So that's my issue with words like escalation. Now, please come back at me. I'm very happy to take DMs and chat about that. And I may have been conceptualising it completely the wrong way. But I think first of all we got to think about it differently. Now, what could we do either from here on, or if there was some kind of nuclear event? Well, I'm not sure it's in the gift of the West, to be honest. I'm not sure what else we could do. I think China has got a massive role to play here, both formally and I mean through the UN. So yesterday we heard Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, saying that the United Nations as exists is not ready for the big challenges that the world faces. He was talking in through the lens of climate change, but I think there was clearly a reference to such things as members of the UN Security Council, permanent members of the UN Security Council invading other countries. So Antonio Guterres is saying that the UN needs to change. I'm not going to get back on my hobby horse about the UN. If you've listened to this before, you'll know my views on that. But let's just take this in particular. Now, what kind of statement would it make if 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, so Britain, the US, France and China, made a public statement condemning the war, condemning these referendums, condemning any form of discussion about the use of nuclear weapons or something? I mean, it's a big ask, because the Chinese very, very rarely like doing this kind of thing. But what statement would that make? What statement would it make if there was such a message that came out from those 4 permanent members with the rest of the UN Security Council and maybe the rest / the majority of the General Assembly? So I wonder if this is the moment where the world needs to step up and to say publicly, no, this is not how you do it. We're still not there yet, that we do no longer resort to killing each other when we have massive international disputes. But nuclear weapons, no first use policy. That needs to be the deal here. So I think there's room there for a public statement, although I don't dismiss how hard that would be to try and get China, in particular, to put their name to something collectively with other nations. But what's happening behind the scenes? I reckon, again here, China, I think, would be absolutely pivotal, saying behind the scenes to Russia, if you do this, you're out of here. We are not going to do anything. We don't think China is sanctions busting and supplying all the sophisticated weaponry that Russia so desperately needs. And if they went further, and very broadly, I think the relationship at the moment is that Russia needs China more than the other way around in terms of trade. I think if China said, no, if you do that, you are not coming, we're not having anything to do with you, I think that would be very, very powerful. Whether that's happening and through what mechanisms, I'm not sure. We need to speak to our colleagues who know much more about the money side of it. We should get Sue back on to ask her. But I think there's some public stuff that should happen. There should be some back channel stuff as well. But I think that China is absolutely central to this. Not that gives me any cause to think that something will happen, but that is where I think we should look to.
Thanks, Dom. And I would completely echo that. And as we were saying earlier on, there's never going to be arguably a better opportunity for that to take place, given that this is the first such event in the UN for 3 years, and we've just had the speech from Putin. You feel like the stars have aligned. If they're ever going to do it, then now is the time. Turning briefly to these sham referenda, that's how many Western leaders are defining them, that are supposed to be taking place starting this weekend in those territories occupied by Russia in the east of Ukraine. Do you think, Dom, there's any way of disrupting those? I mean, if those take place, and they are, of course, we can very, very safely assume that they would, given Russian machinations there would ask to become part of Russia. Is there anything we can be doing to stop those referenda from taking place? Because if they do, then one feels that will be something that Russia will use as a very powerful tool in the coming months ahead. I'm just wondering if there's what your thoughts are on that, and whether this is something that actually is a really pivotal moment, the next 48 hours, to try and disrupt something that's going on. Do you think it's possible?
No, I don't. I think you're right that the next 48 hours are pivotal, but I think it's your earlier comment there, the UN, that's where the real important stuff's going to happen, not these the sham referendum. And I don't think there's any need to, because it won't work. I mean, they can say whatever they like. And if there's evidence, if you get in there, I don't even know how these things are going to happen. Is it going to be some sort of... Is it going to be done online? And I can't imagine the infrastructure. I just don't know how it's going to happen. But if the West got in there somehow, GCHQ, NSA got to know what, to try and fiddle around here. If there were any kind of breadcrumbs left at all, Russia would just delight in highlighting that to the world. I think it's irrelevant. I think anybody who can look at this sensibly will see these efforts for what they are. So I don't think you need to really try and disrupt them at all. I mean, look at how people have responded to Crimea. I don't think. Very few countries in the world actually recognise Crimea as part of Russia now, and I think it's all the usual suspects, all Syrias and North Koreas of the world, Belarus. So I don't think we need to. I think that might continue this effort that we've seen over the last few years of trying to meet Russian idiocy with sense and fact and calm reason. And it just doesn't work. They're not going to. You can't beat these guys by fact checking. So don't try. You just end up putting a huge amount of effort in, getting very frustrated for no reason whatsoever. I'm not trying to downplay this at all, but I mean that's what the NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organisation, is all about. Don't meet Russian misinformation with fact. Meet them with cartoon dogs, because that's how they can't do irony, they can't do humour, they can't respond to anything outside the sort of hard disinformation channels. So no, I don't think there's any value in really trying to discredit these referendum. We should sit back and watch to see how it's done, and then save for posterity all the images of whoever the returning officer will be to say, and there was a 98.2% response here saying yes. I mean, it is ridiculous. We shouldn't treat it as anything other than ridiculous, and trying to disrupt it, even if that was possible, I think would be giving it a credibility it doesn't deserve.
Thanks, Dom. Roland, do you agree with that? What's your view on the significance or lack thereof of these referenda in Ukraine?
I agree with Dom. There's no point trying to disrupt it. I mean, we understand, to answer Dom's question about how will this be done, they're talking about a mixture of ballot voting and online voting. So that's already been discussed. We already know the outcome. I mean, Russian state media is already reporting, we're going to have 4 new regions next week. I mean, it's just, it's going to happen. They're going to announce a result, and these will become new oblasts of the Russian Federation. Unless I'm quite surprised, I'm quite happy to be surprised. I'm often surprised, but that looks like the way things are going. That looks like how it's been signalled. I mean, the motive for this is interesting as well. We've talked a lot about the nuclear pathway, but there's other things here. So Medusa, the independent Russian outlet, had a very interesting report last night when all this started being flagged, and they said part of the motive for this was that the politologists. Now, politologist is it's kind of a Russian word for a spin doctor, basically, a kind of a master of the dark arts of managing of the public and so on, and managing politics in these in Luhansk and Donetsk, which are kind of weird, astroturfed, Russian-run, pseudo-independent, on the surface republics. Very weird situation. Anyway, Medusa was saying their sources close to the Kremlin were saying these guys had come back to Moscow after the offensive and said, listen, they're panicked. All right, we've got a lot of panic already in Kherson, people worrying that the Ukrainians are going to come back. The collaborators who work with us, they're worried they're going to come back. And now we're hearing it in Luhansk and Donetsk. So you've got to do something to quieten down, to reassure the people who've sided with us there. And their report was that, the guys who were advocating with them then allied with, the Siloviki, the security agency guys who really wanted a mobilization and so on. And they went to Putin together and persuaded him. Now, how true is all that? I don't know. But I definitely think it will have folded in to the discussion. And there's another point. Just I think Dom's right to, we do get boxed into kind of talking about nukes. It may not be about kind of frightening everyone into ending the war now, but do your Crimea thing, do your Donbass thing. Say I've annexed this area. Tell the Russian public that you're now fighting a defensive war for the integrity of the Russian Federation. Dig in. Because you can't win on the offensive because the Ukrainians have the initiative. It's easier to hold ground. It's going to be than to take it. It's going to be winter. 300,000 men, if they manage to raise them. Well, winter's coming. The war should slow down, and the guys who are fighting need to be rotated out and rested. What I'm getting to is that the motive is, if it's not about scaring people into ending the war immediately, it's about freezing it for some amount of time or readying for a longer haul, which again is something I think everyone should have been ready for anyway. We knew this was going to be a long haul, but everything indicates that the Kremlin is getting ready to just keep going and keep going and keep going into the future in the hope that the West will get exhausted before they do.
Thanks, Roland. And I agree. And I think it's an interesting strategy because, as we've talked about so many times on this podcast, it appears that the position from a Russian perspective will only get weaker as time goes on, whether one's factoring in the military situation or the economic one. But Dom, we were just touching on nukes there, and I'm conscious we're going to have to start wrapping up soon. But what is the battlefield value of nukes in the worst case scenario? I mean, they've been talked about at length already, but just wondering what your general reflections are on the significance of these or lack of.
Yeah, okay, let's quickly touch on nukes then. So as Roland said earlier on, it's difficult to make the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. I mean, there is a number, but really, it's grades of horrific effect. But essentially, by tactical nuclear weapons, we are talking about weapons that have a yield of less than 1,000. Less than one kiloton, so 1,000 tons of TNT. 100,000 tons of TNT. I've got that wrong. Sorry, I apologise. But not much bigger than the biggest conventional explosion that you see nowadays. So tactical nukes can go from very low up to about 150 kilotons. Now, for comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. So the biggest tactical nuclear weapons are really quite big. I mean, bigger, 10 times the size of Hiroshima. So they are not small. However, they can, as I say, go right down to fairly, in inverted commas, small explosions, not much bigger than conventional explosions that we've seen, that we see already. Now, we don't know. We don't know what Russia may or may not field, but a tactical nuclear weapon rather than a strategic one that's going an intercontinental ballistic missile. Tactical nuclear weapons are much more seen as much more battlefield weapons. So they would be aimed at major airfields, for example, a carrier strike group. They might be large formations of troops or major logistic areas, rear areas, or anything like that. So, I mean, they would have it would be a large area that was destroyed, but I mean, not the sort of the thousands of kilotons of the strategic nuclear weapons. So when you look at the size of Ukraine and the dispositions of all the Ukrainian armed forces, bearing in mind that the front line is 1,300 kilometers from Kherson through the Donbass up to Kharkiv. It was shortened 10 days ago because of that the massive assault up there. But we're talking a very, very long front line, and so a huge number of troops there, Ukrainian troops, huge number of troops there, and a huge number of troops behind them, supporting them, rotating in and out, logistic hubs, etc., etc. So where are you going to put your tactical nuclear weapon? Bearing in mind it would be on the big map of Ukraine, a fairly small area. Of course, there would be a lot of radioactivity, and that would have a downwind effect, and it would cause big problems elsewhere. But in terms of the actual blast, where are you going to put it? Because it would have on a country the size of Ukraine, it would have, I would suggest, limited effect overall. It could open up a gap, so maybe if you've got the forces ready, you can then pile through that gap and take a huge piece of land behind. But Russia can't do that. So what would they use it for? So the only way that tactical nuclear weapons, I'm suggesting, would have battlefield utility in Ukraine right now would be Putin would have to use a few of them, certainly more than one. I don't know. I'm not suggesting he'd use sort of 100 or what have you, but he'd have to use a few. Otherwise, it's largely meaningless, and he would draw all the wrath of the world and all the unintended consequences that he's not even thought of on top of him for potentially very little gain. So I don't think we're at the stage where we're going from where we are today to the potential use of, let's say, dozens, small number, small digit, high digit, 8, 9 tactical nuclear weapons. I just can't see it happening. To use one would be utterly irrelevant. To have any kind of military battlefield use, you'd need, let's say, 8, 9, 10. And I just can't see that happening right now for all the response he would get. So yeah, these are horrific weapons. Oh, and I also can't see a tactical nuclear weapon, so a smaller yield nuclear weapon being thrown into the centre of Kyiv, for example, because it might be a smaller nuclear weapon, but that would have strategic effect. And it's the effect we've got to focus on here, not the actual weapon that's used, I suggest. So I just can't. I don't think that we're at that level yet. And whilst the individual blast would be utterly horrific, and I can see the DMs arriving already, people putting me right, and thank you for that. I will update this if I've been wildly wrong. But yeah, we just need to think about, well, one is almost irrelevant. How many are you going to go for? And are we at the stage where you're going to leap from nothing to the use of multiple numbers of tactical nuclear weapons of about up to 150 kilotons? I don't think so at the moment.
Well, thank you, Dom, as ever, for your military insights. Actually, just as you've been speaking, I've seen that President Zelensky has actually said that he doesn't believe the world would allow Putin to use these nuclear weapons. So an interesting intervention from him there. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So I'm just going to ask for your final thoughts. Roland, you're on the ground in Ukraine. You've been listening and contributing today. What are your final thoughts for us?
I think we're in a very interesting place. I think this whole year has been interesting. History grinds. Vladimir Putin is taking an enormous risk because he's found himself in a much worse place than he's ever been at any point at his time in office. And I don't know what is going to be the outcome of this. I do think that he feels that he's vulnerable. I think he's vulnerable. And I think ultimately, defeat on the battlefield is, he's staring at it down the barrel. And for that reason, I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't think the headbangers, more technical term, right, than the headbangers, but I mean, the extreme right, these people in Moscow who think they can kind of magically unlock the spirit of 1941 and 1812 by telling the Russians that you're now in a war of national survival and you've all got to join up and we're going to give you rifles and go off. Listen, Russians do wars of national survival incredibly well. They have a fantastic sense of what needs to be done and sacrifice and all of that, but only when it is a war of national survival, and that is the spirit the Ukrainians are displaying at the moment. They're not going to be able to unlock that. That's just there is no way they can turn around and tell the Russian public, Napoleon's at the gates of Moscow, or the Wehrmacht are on the way. It's time for us to remember what our grandfathers did in World War II. It's just not going to fly. So I don't ultimately see this gambit succeeding, but I don't know where it's going to go before the end of this.
Thank you very much, Roland. And Dom, I'll give you the final word.
Oh, thanks, Francis. I think we've got to be looking at the UN today, especially, but looking to the UN to step up to this. I mean, I've not tried to be too light here. I do echo my words from earlier on that we should all be concerned, but I urge you, do not be scared by this. That is what Putin wants. He wants to terrorize us. He wants us to be scared. We should not be scared. We should be concerned. But this is not a game. I don't mean to suggest in any way that it is. I would suggest it is our thinking about all of us and our representatives in the UN and all the things we said earlier on about the UN Security Council have to do something here. They've got to get China on board. Now's the time to change, to break the model, to do something different, to show the path to the future. I don't mean to sound too hyperbolic here, but this is today. This is where we are. It is our terrible privilege to be alive today and have to deal with these things and this egregious assault on humanity, and history will not thank us if we blink now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you found this podcast informative, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show in your country. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. And thank you to all of those who direct message us on Twitter from the farthest corners of the globe. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.